So we're going to go about an hour and 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions, and you can ask your questions. So let me introduce our panel. Hezekiah Watkins goes by Heck, right? In 1961, young Hezekiah Watkins was arrested at the Greyhound bus station in Jackson, Mississippi at the age of 13, where he was sent in a paddy wagon to Mississippi State Penitentiary known as Parchman Penitentiary and placed on death row. His crime: allegedly participating with a group known as the Freedom Riders, who had embarked on a journey from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans to push for equal rights for African Americans while also desegregating bus terminals throughout the South. After spending 5 days at Parchman, Hezekiah's life would forever be changed. He would continue his involvement in Mississippi's fight for equality, resulting in him being arrested over 100 times more in the years to follow. These experiences guided him along a path to focus on improving the quality of life for African Americans everywhere, eventually resulting in Hezekiah's recognition by the 112th Congress of the United States for his service to Mississippi and mankind. Ladies and gentlemen, Hezekiah Watkins. Nihad Awad is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, the largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States. In 1994, Mr. Awad co-founded CAIR in Washington, D.C., which has grown to 34 offices nationwide. In 1997, Mr. Awad served on the Civil Rights Advisory Panel to the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security. In 2001, he was part of a select group of American Muslim leaders invited by President Bush to join him at a press conference condemning the 9/11 attacks and acts of anti-Muslim intolerance that followed. In 2006, he led a delegation to Iraq to seek the release of American journalist Jill Carroll, who was later released unharmed. In 2011, he led a delegation to Iran to lobby for the release of 2 American hikers who had been imprisoned. He is widely recognized as one of the world's most influential Muslim leaders, being cited annually in the Arabian Business Power 100 and the world's 500 most influential Muslims. Ladies and gentlemen, Nihad Awad. Amanda Venta. Dr. Venta joined the faculty of Sam Houston State University in the fall of 2015 as an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and Philosophy. She received her BA from Rice University and her MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Houston. Dr. Venta's clinical training focused on children, adolescents, and families. Her primary research interests are the development of mental illnesses in youth and the protective effect of parent-child attachment. She has recently focused on the psychological functioning of recently immigrated adolescents from Central America with related research and clinical work. She has received research funding from the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. Wow, that's the biggest words I've ever read in my life. The National Institutes of Mental Health and the American Psychological Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Amanda Venta. Lynn Liberato is a partner in the appellate section of Haynes & Boone, which is a Texas-based international law firm. She was selected in 2019 by the Texas Bar Foundation to receive the Gregory S. Coleman Outstanding Texas Appellate Lawyer Award. Most recently, she was named a commissioner in the Texas Legislature's Judicial Selection Commission, which serves with the Texas legislators to evaluate and recommend possible changes to the method of judicial selection in Texas. Boy, we could use that, Lynn.
I think so.
Good luck. She has argued before the United States Supreme Court and represented the NFL during the Houston Super Bowl in 2017. Among many other matters, she has handled trial and appellate courts. Lynn includes among her proudest achievements her selection as Volunteer of the Year for the United Way of Greater Houston, winning the Karen H. Sussman ADL Jurisprudence Award, election as president of the State Bar of Texas, and election as the first woman president of the Houston Bar Association. Her reoccurring article on summary judgments is one of the most cited law review articles in judicial opinions in the nation. She has a BS in photojournalism from Sam Houston State University, an MS in journalism from Texas A&M Commerce, and a JD from South Texas College of Law, each school having named her an outstanding alumni. Ladies and gentlemen, Lynn Liberato. Okay, let's just jump right in. A little bit of history here. We don't have time to go over a big history lesson, but Abraham Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. This, of course, changed the direction of the Civil War and it eventually led to the freeing of the slaves. He signed the 13th Amendment, formally abolishing slavery in the U.S. on February 1st, 1865. At the time, in 1865, people considered that the end of discrimination. We all know that that probably was not the end of discrimination. Looking back on it, let's start with Amanda. What was it?
The end of discrimination?
No, it wasn't the end of discrimination, so what was it? What was it? Signing of the 13th Amendment, so what was it?
Well, it certainly wasn't the end of discrimination. I think probably it was maybe the beginning or an important step in the beginning towards us trying to heal race relations, right? Having to negotiate for the first time free people trying to get on across different races. But I think, of course, we've made progress from that time, but we certainly haven't solved any problems as far as the deep injuries of slavery.
Well, the other thing it did, it seems to me, is that...
Speak up.
I think that another thing it did, and it reminds me in some ways of what's going on now, is that certainly it was absolutely the right thing and an incredible watershed in our history, but it created a huge backlash that led to Jim Crow and just terrible, shameful things in our country's history. And I think that one of the lessons as we look at what happened then and we look forward is that, you know, I have to admit I was as joyful as I've ever been in my life when Barack Obama got elected. And I think now we're seeing a backlash to that. Again, not as bad, I don't mean to suggest that, but it does seem like that as we make a step, multiple steps forward, necessarily there's a step backwards. But we have a true American hero who experienced this backlash and the terrible parts of Jim Crow, so I should be quiet and defer to you.
So let's not jump too far ahead, though.
Okay.
Sticking back with the end of slavery, you know, if at that time people considered this to be this momentous occasion in the United States, and it was a momentous occasion. We had to end slavery. It did end, but you brought up actually the next point, the beginning of Jim Crow, which lasted from 1877 to around 1950. That's a long, hard time in the United States.
Well, Jim Crow was slavery itself.
Expand on that.
Well, you had individuals who were still enslaved but was not enslaved. They were staying on plantations. They was accused of committing crimes that they did not. And by being accused of committing a crime, then you was held in, say, Parchman Prison. That's whereas you was able to work off your fine as a slave, but you was not labeled a slave. You was labeled a convict. You was incarcerated there at the prison. You did all work that was done by a slave. If I'm getting through right,
I get it.
Yeah. And it just went on. It went on until Congress probably found out that this is just another form of slavery that's being inflicted upon the individuals for no reason.
So this is for any of you. What were we so afraid of?
Well, I think the slaves, from what I've read, the slave was afraid of being free. They had been held in bondage for so long, and they didn't know how to act or what to do or what they could do. And they was afraid to move out on their own to do something.
So you're saying this, that at the time that the 13th Amendment was signed and leading up through at least the beginning of the Jim Crow era, the slaves were afraid to be free.
I believe so.
Y'all agree with that?
Probably because they feared retaliation from their masters, and obviously they have not experienced freedom for hundreds of years. So I don't say they coexisted with their conditions, because we don't speak for them,
Right.
but I think, they have not experienced what freedom is like, because they have seen the massive brutality and oppression against them. And obviously the South was ready to fight and was fighting other white people over slavery. I may add also that Benjamin Franklin did not prohibit slavery. He started the end of slavery era, but I don't think it was prohibited. He signed the proclamation to end it, but it was not prohibited.
So, y'all want to add something on that?
I would say that I think that the struggle is then fragmented, right? And that's frightening to everybody. So if when slavery is institutionalized, there's an institution, right, that people can either support or fight against. And that is sort of a simpler, cleaner line of where you fall on that debate. And then a lot of the things that were being discussed, right, in terms of the Jim Crow era and after that, the freeing slaves, right, or the Emancipation Proclamation fragments the issue, where you can oppose slavery, or you don't need to oppose slavery anymore, but how do you oppose racism, right? Or how do you then go on to oppose Jim Crow? Or how do you oppose all of the things that are going on now, right? And so I think it just becomes a much more complicated struggle, regardless of what side of the issue you're on. So I think both parties at that time were probably frightened about the new frontiers that would come, despite the fact that it was obviously a move in the right direction, like you said.
Well, how about today? What are we afraid of today? I mean, it's 2020. And we are looking at the same issues,
Yeah.
just bottled up and directed at somebody different.
And not somebody different. We're still afraid of all people of color.
But also I can say that in the past, at least, when slavery was the norm, was used for economic reasons. So the hatred element probably was there, but they enslaved people because they wanted to use them to build America and to use them in free labor to build their own economy at the expense and on the backs of African Americans. Today, we don't have slavery, but we have discrimination. I know that during Jim Crow, the slogan was separate but equal. I, as a student of history, as I learned about the civil rights movement, I don't think it was separate and equal. It was separate and unequal. And that is based on prejudice and false sense of superiority over other people because of their skin color. And we feel it today. Now, different minorities who are non-white, so excuse me, white people, I'm not talking to you, but really, the hatred towards non-white people is very evident. It's now more sophisticated. People can argue on television, and they try to make convince you that they are right, and that is the danger. And discrimination now is being promoted, legitimized, normalized, and well packaged in 21st century language, and to me that's dangerous.
One of my favorite sayings is that everybody likes progress, but nobody likes change. And there are multiple factors in answering the question that you ask. But I do think that one of those relates to this whole concept of change. You know, you can always give people things, and they're happy to be, of course, to be given things. But when you take something away, it's very, very difficult. And when you take away white privilege, that is going to have an effect. Because, and I think that's some of what we're seeing now. I think there are many factors to it. And I've really tried to wrap my head around what's causing this. What's at the root of what I still see. There are many good people who I think can be so wrong on these issues. Some not so good people too. But if I may tell a story to illustrate my point, my father went to the Naval Academy. And he graduated in 1951, and this won't surprise you, every other midshipman at the Naval Academy was a white male. Well, fast forward several years, and 20 years ago or so, and we were talking about affirmative action. And he was saying about all the evils of affirmative action and the fact that you should just be qualified and be judged on your own basis and this sort of thing. And I said to my dad, who was a very well-meaning person, and a good person, I said, Dad, you had the ultimate affirmative action. The ultimate. And he's like, what are you talking about? I said, you could not get into the Naval Academy unless you were a white male. And I remember my dad being a flummox, which he never was. I mean, that had never occurred to him. And my point is that it's easy, and I'm sure I do too, I don't want to sound in any way self-righteous about this or judgmental of other people, because I have to look to myself and the guilt, times of being guilty of this sort of thing. But it's very difficult when your norm is what happens to you, and then you look at something else, and that's a change in the norm. And my husband's here, and he was involved whenever he worked for a corporation with giving out benefits. But anytime you pull away a benefit, he's talked about this, people get mad, right? I see people nodding, even if it was a benefit they used to not have, but economics change. So my point, Chris, and I apologize for going on a long time about this, but I do think that an element of good people thinking what in my view is wrong comes from a place of misunderstanding and a place of looking at their lives or their situations and not seeing that the norm is not necessarily the good
Right.
or the right.
You know, one of my kids thought my view was wrong one time, but I grounded them.
Oh, good.
And it worked.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So, Heck, you were right in the middle of the civil rights movement, and I want to talk a little bit about what a freedom rider was. Maybe some people here that are too young to have ever heard of a freedom rider, and that's unfortunate. So what was a freedom rider?
Before I answer that, I want to go back to a statement that this lady made.
Okay.
Okay, you made a statement that people of color, of your color, I'm assuming, was afraid of people of color.
Yeah, my color is Hispanic.
Okay, good. I'm black. Why would you be afraid of me?
Yeah, I think ultimately we have a in-group, out-group problem. I think this is bad. I think we're animals in tribes, and we are fundamentally wired to take care of our own tribe and fear other tribes. And so then the question is, who's your tribe, right? What is your tribe? And your tribe could be along color lines, your tribe could be along ethnic lines, your tribe could be along religious lines. But I think still today, there are in-group, out-group fears that dominate public policies, dominate social interactions. People are much more likely to be friends with members of their own religion, members of their own religious group, members of their same socioeconomic status. So I think ultimately that is about fear and survival of your own group, however you define your group.
Okay. I disagree with you. Ma'am, on the end, you stated something about white flight,
White privilege.
white privilege, yes. And I was trying to, I have a problem out of this old left ear over
Uh-oh.
here. And I was just trying to understand, get a better understanding of what was being said about white privileges. When white privileges has always been there. White privilege has not left. White privilege is not going anywhere. It's gonna be here through my lifetime, it will be, and probably through my grandkids' lifetime. Now, you know, I sum this thing up a different way. I look at you having your white flight, your white privileges, and Hezekiah want to have some privileges as well. Why I can't have privileges like your privileges that you have? Will you help me? Or will you help the next person?
Yes?
Okay, okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, I think that was your.
Thank you.
I think that was her point.
The point,
I think
yeah.
that was the point she was making.
Okay, you know, I said this on left ear.
Yeah.
I'm on the left side too, so I'm gonna take that excuse.
Now, we was about to talk about Freedom Riders.
Tell us quickly what the Freedom Riders were.
Okay, the Freedom Riders was a group of young men and women, black and white, who came from different states, probably every state in the Union, who converged on Mississippi, Alabama, but mostly Mississippi, just tried to make matters better for blacks and for whomever. And a gentleman by the name of George Foreman, out of D.C., I believe.
Not the boxer.
Not the boxer. Might have been Foreman, but not the boxer. Got a group of kids together, and they wanted to test the waters of interstate commerce. Whereas the federal government had stated that any facility, restroom facility, or water would be equal to each person that enter a bus station, a train station, or an airport, because they were receiving federal funds and they wanted everything on equal basis. I think the law was passed, I believe in 1958, but it took them to 1961 to really test the waters, and they got a group of kids together from different parts of the United States, and they began to go through different cities and states and just test the waters.
By testing the waters, you mean
By testing the facilities,
by openly violating the segregation laws?
well, it wasn't a segregation law, because the federal government had ruled that those places must be open and available to any and every person. So if anyone was breaking the law,
It was them.
it was them.
All right, so you were going in and trying to use the facilities,
Exactly.
and they were still keeping you from it.
From it, right.
How
Now
many
this,
times were you arrested?
I'm told 109. I'm really not sure.
And were you on a bus that was firebombed by the KKK?
No, I was lucky. I was one of the lucky ones that I wasn't firebombed.
Yeah, that is lucky.
Yeah, yeah. But a lot of other things happened along the way. So,
Well, we thank you for what you did.
thank you, sir. Thank you.
You have a book here that you've written, and it's there and available. And I want to thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
So, in 1968, the Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress, signed by Lyndon Johnson. That was a momentous occasion, I guess, for the country. Let's talk for a minute about the net effect of that act and what it did for moving the country forward. Anybody want to jump in on it?
Well, one of the things it did was move the country backward in one sense, and only since we've been talking about that. Lyndon Johnson himself said that we'll lose the South for a generation as a result of signing the Civil Rights Act. And I think politically, he was right. So that wasn't the positive part. Of course, they're tremendous. It's the basis for and a sea change in the changes in the law that are on balance, obviously,
So-
very good.
Don't
But-
just jump off that statement that Lyndon
Okay.
Johnson made, because that's probably one of the most important political statements that's been made by a president in a very, very long time. And I want you to expand on that a little bit.
Well, the idea is, or his concept was that at that point, the Democratic Party was the predominant party in the Old South, including Texas. And he knew, being the savvy politician that he was, and he knew it was the right thing to do, and I respect him greatly for that. But at the same time, he knew that the downside of that is that the South would abandon the Democratic Party. And in fact, that's what happened. So more practically what happened is that the party split at first, and so you had the conservative Democrats and the liberal Democrats, but ultimately that conservative wing, because many people believe, because of the civil rights movement, switched and became the Republican Party of what we have today,
And the South has been voting largely Republican ever since.
beyond largely,
Yeah.
right? If
Yeah.
you figure in Texas, we haven't had a statewide Democrat elected in a generation now, 20 years at least.
So let's talk about the positive effects of the Civil
So I didn't
Rights
mean
Act.
to be a
No,
downer,
no,
but it
I
was
think that's
consistent with our earlier
extremely important point.
discussion.
So
Yeah.
let's talk, somebody jump in on the positive effects of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Anybody?
It allowed each individual to become registered to vote. And that meant a lot, especially to blacks. And blacks got out in numbers. They became registered and they voted. State that I come from, Mississippi, Mississippi has the largest number of elected African Americans in these United States. And that was because of the Voting Act. It was because of individuals getting out, knocking on doors, making sure you was registered. Not just making sure you was registered, but also making sure that you got out on that voting day to vote. And yes, sir, that was and still is, in my opinion, one of the greatest times of my life for that to be signed.
Anybody else before I ask another question? 2013, you talked about the Voting Rights Act. 2013, the Supreme Court overturned Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder. Okay, let me tell you a little aside on that. I was representing a school district in Houston, North Forest Independent School District. The state of Texas was trying to close them. I was representing them in federal court. I was representing them at the state level and in federal court. We sued the state on the Voting Rights Act. We argued it in federal court, and the federal judge said, I'm gonna rule tomorrow on this. Let me think about it tonight, I'll rule tomorrow. And the next morning at 9 a.m., Shelby County versus Holder came out, and the federal judge ruled, I would have granted this, but, and they closed the school district at 10 a.m. So, I want you to talk, and Lynn, I'm gonna go to you first because you do this for a living. I want you to talk about when they killed Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, what did that do to the states like Texas and Mississippi and these states in the South that the Voting Rights Act was preventing them from discriminating in their voting.
So what the Supreme Court held was that the requirement under the Voting Rights Act that certain states, which included Texas and Mississippi, get pre-clearance from the Justice Department anytime they made a change to voting rights or the ability to vote. And it could be in a small jurisdiction, or large jurisdiction, but within those states, school board, whatever. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, determined that that the basis under the the Voting Rights Act for allowing that was outdated. That the jurisdictions that came under that provision, so New York didn't, Ohio didn't, Mississippi did, Texas did, and that was based on historic patterns of trying to inhibit voting rights. The Supreme Court said that was too old, that was no longer relevant to look back that far, and therefore, essentially, it's a little bit more complexity than this, but the bottom line is that those states no longer had to get pre-clearance. So the question comes, and this is where the lawyer part comes in. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that those provisions can't be challenged in court. But think about it as a practical matter. I mean, you guys know, you're not thinking anybody else is a lawyer other than Chris. It takes years to go through the courts and go through the appellate process. And so the practicality of it is that it took a major part of that oversight, that pre-clearance. And the other thing, it's a little bit like Chris was talking about, was it your son who disagreed with you
Yeah.
and you put him in timeout?
Yeah.
Well, he
That
knows
was
not to
actually true.
disagree again, right? Because he knows what's going to happen is he's going into timeout. Similarly, if Texas, which it did, then creates or enforces a law that inhibits people's voting rights, and they know they have the pre-clearance, they have to do the pre-clearance, are they as likely to do it? Absolutely not. But if they know they've got 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years, then are they going to do it? And the answer is yes, and indeed that's what's happened.
And the important thing about the pre-clearance was it prevented them from gerrymandering districts so
That's
that
right.
they could prevent African American districts. And now, without Section 5, they're free to do whatever they want.
Well, and it goes even beyond that. So, the Sunday voting.
Right.
Not disallowing Sunday voting, closer to some of you, disallowing a 17-year-old to pre-register so that when he or she turns 18, that they can vote if their birthday falls on, their 18th birthday falls on the election day. And they're all laws, and many of them have come into effect, that are designed to inhibit the ability of young people and diverse people, particularly African Americans, but Hispanics too, to suppress their ability to vote.
Okay, so let's move on, so we don't run out of time here. Was the election of Barack Obama a good thing for civil rights?
I think the election of Barack Obama was good for America because it's a democracy, and everybody who's born in the U.S. is entitled to be the president, regardless of their skin color. So, but that also, I think it culminated that the civil rights movement succeeded in changing the course of history. It should not have been written the way it was written, based on discrimination. So Barack Obama was probably the tip of the iceberg of many African Americans who dreamt to be like him decades ago. So it just happened at the right time. And Barack Obama was attacked for being a Muslim. He was not a Muslim. And that was even used in the election campaign. And if you remember the famous debate or town hall for the late John McCain, when a lady you know, wanted to attack Barack Obama, and she said, but he's an Arab. And the late John McCain, instead of saying, so what? Even if he was a Muslim or Arab, so what? We are a free country. He said, no man, no man, no man. He's a good man, he's a good man. And the only one who gave the right answer was Colin Powell on television, and he said, yes, you know, so what? What if he was an Arab? We are a free country, and we give people chances. Yeah, Barack Obama represented a major shift in American history and politics, and hopefully a commitment that America upholds, you know, the law, and everyone has a fair chance at being a president if they are qualified.
I agree with that. But did he set back, by being elected as the first African American, did he set back civil rights?
Well, in the views of those who do not like African Americans or people of color, they thought that this is the end of civil rights.
That's my question.
Yeah, that people should not ask for more. As if by the election of Barack Obama, you know, we've undone the injustice that was committed for hundreds of years against African Americans and people of color. And when in fact Barack Obama just, you know, happened to be the president, but discrimination continued against African Americans. In fact, many people were targeted in retaliation because the person in the White House is an African American.
Let me read this quote by Mitch McConnell when there was a discussion. I don't know if Barack Obama was still in the White House or he was out, but there was a discussion about, he was out, discussion about reparations. I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. We've tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African American president, intimating that was enough. Electing Barack Obama solved all of the issues related to slavery. So I ask the question again, was Barack Obama a good thing for civil rights? Amen.
Well, I agree with what was said
I do too.
already, yeah. I'll also say that I think he held a mirror to more subtle issues, right? So I think, not to bring up Donald Trump, but
We're going to.
then I'll bring up Donald Trump. I think some of the issues that Barack Obama's presidency brought up, right, were the amount of attention that was directed towards him, potentially because he was a person of color, right? So if we think about some of the stuff that Donald Trump said on the campaign trail, or Donald Trump said shortly before being elected, right? I'm thinking of the Access Hollywood stuff, right? The stuff that is just really bad, really embarrassing stuff that came out. And then in contrast, Barack Obama is getting raked over the coals for potentially not having a birth certificate, right? Something that is completely invented. And so I think, while certainly there was part of the American populace that thought the civil rights movement is over, we've done enough, everybody quiet down because now we have a black president, it also has brought up, both during his presidency and afterward, that there's a lot of implicit stuff going on that continues to be problematic, and that race relations are still far from being solved, even though we had a black president. We had a black president who we mistreated in comparison to a white president that we let get away with all kinds of stuff.
Heck, well, how do you feel about that, Heck?
In terms
Still
of,
on
in terms of civil rights, I think he brought a new meaning to civil rights. I think we relaxed more so than we should have during his administration. We thought the race was over. We thought we had won that race, but it was just beginning, and we did not see it coming. But we see it now.
That's a good point. All right, I want to turn a little bit to 9/11 and the rise of Islamophobia. And we don't have time to go over the history of the Middle East and the reasons for the rise of Al Qaeda, and we're not going to go over that. But in 9/11, when the Twin Towers say that 5 times each. Twin Towers were attacked and forever changed the way the way we look at each other. I think we can all agree on that. Nihad, you know we're going to start with you on this. What was it like to be a Muslim in the United States on 9/11?
I remember every single second of that day. I do. Because my religion was hijacked. And the perpetrators claimed to be Muslim. And also because I'm the head of the largest Muslim civil rights organization, I knew how my religion and the community will be falsely associated with this, and to get ready for the backlash. I was probably mile and a half away from the Pentagon when it was hit. And it took me like 3 hours to get to my office to work on a statement, to put things in context, and help the nation and the government and the media to understand that what happened was an attack on all of us by people who claim to be Muslim. And I had to remind all of us that there are elements in every faith community who will misinterpret it and abuse it. And if people will argue with me over that, I will argue back with them. You know, there are abundance of examples in history where there are people who claim to be Jews and they killed innocent people. And there are people who claim to be Christians and they killed people in the name of Judaism and in the name of Christianity. And no one blamed Judaism as a faith or Christianity as a faith, because we know better. But that understanding was not afforded to Muslims. Why? Because unfortunately, despite the fact that Islam is the second largest religion in the world, 1.5 billion people, Islam is severely misunderstood and maligned in the United States and in the West in general. And also we knew what would be coming. And luckily we had an organization like CARE who was able to help. We met with the president, and the president made a statement cautioning against any backlash against innocent people.
And that may have helped, but
Yeah, it did not stop it,
Right.
because, you know, as you said, the rise of Islamophobia. Islamophobia has been there for centuries, in literature, in Hollywood movies, in the news that I watch on television, on Fox News. Every day I've seen Islamophobia before 9/11. But 9/11 was exploited by people who have an agenda, and they exploited it in an ugly fashion. And we're still paying the price for what other people have done.
Since 9/11, it's probably been harder for a Muslim to do day-to-day things. Get on a plane, buy a ticket, go shopping. Are those true statements?
That's true. And imagine if you are African American and Muslim, and woman, African American woman, Muslim, and we are in hijab. You know, all these
The
elements.
trifecta.
So like, I mean, the history of discrimination and racism, targeting people who look differently or who practice their faith differently, is not new to America. And yes, you know, we're just the latest victim of bigotry and racism in the United States, but we're not like, you know, we're not special. So yeah, in a way, it has become more difficult, and we document so many hate crimes and discrimination acts against Muslims. But also on a positive note, I would say, while before 9/11, the majority of commentators and politicians will speak on behalf of the Muslim community in a false manner, today the Muslim community speaks for itself. And the Muslim community is more civically engaged than others, and than other time. And, you know, the Muslim community is really pushing back against stereotypes and discrimination. And we're learning from all other minorities who have come before us, especially African American people.
The Donald Trump, and I don't want to turn this into Donald Trump bashing segment, but Donald Trump has, with his rhetoric, from the day he rode the escalator down and announced his candidacy, has these are my words, been very caustic towards immigrants in this country. And I think that has gone a long way, again, my words, towards creating hostility in the United States among at least Donald Trump's supporters towards immigrants. Lynn, do you want to talk about that and what you see as creating a divide in the United States?
Well, it's certainly, in my view, what you say is true. I don't think it is unique to our times. My family is Italian and
I was about to say that exact same thing.
Yeah, and
So was my family.
as we both have O's at the end of our names, and I know that my great-grandparents and grandparents did everything they could then to run away from their Italian heritage. They refused to speak Italian in the home, and that was their way of dealing with being the other.
Right.
And before that, it was the Irish, and as far as immigrants. So it's a sad history, but maybe go back to, as Amanda was saying, about tribes. I don't feel like I have any great insight into it. It makes me sad, but that's not any insight.
But how does a country that was built on immigrants, built on immigration, spend every generation discriminating against one set of immigrants?
We did it then too.
Huh?
I think we did it then too. I think
That's
we've
what I'm
done it
talking
all
about.
the time, yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. I mean, we've discriminated against every set of immigrants that came here, yet we built the country off their back. My family came here at the turn of the last century, was discriminated against when they got here. And like Lynn said, everyone that came was discriminated against in their own way. And now we're discriminating against those that want to come here in building a wall and not allowing them in and mixing together those who are fleeing. I'm forgetting my terminology now, but who,
Asylum seekers.
thank
Mhm.
you. Mixing asylum seekers with those who are just trying to get into the country illegally. And so it seems to me to be a difficult problem for us to do.
I think we don't deal with the problem or solve the problem because the problem makes money for America. I think my mom always says, it's about the almighty dollar. You gotta trace the almighty dollar, right? So I think if we trace the almighty dollar here, ultimately people make money off of disenfranchised workers who are undocumented. People make money off of, folks that are willing to come over the Texas-Mexico border and work on their ranches and work in agriculture and then go back and don't draw any social services. I think it's ultimately about money. And if we actually wanted to solve an immigration problem or change immigration policies, we would do so. So like my parents are Cuban immigrants. And I think if you look at like Cuba and Nicaragua, they're not so different from a lot of the other countries that bring large numbers of immigrants from Latin America. The ways in which they're different is that there was a US motivation to be kind to those immigrants, right? So in the case of Cuba, there was a very threatening communist ally of Russia, right? That was just 90 miles off the coast of Key West and was very dangerous. And so there was an incentive to allow Cuban immigrants to come here without any money or potentially any education or potentially all kinds of diseases, right? All the things that we fear about immigrants. We let all the Cubans bring all those same scary things because it was in the interest of the US to do so, right? And I think we don't apply those same policies to other groups of Central Americans when it's not in our interest, and on the contrary, it's in our interest to either have them work here for free and not get any benefits, or it's in our interest to detain them in for-profit prisons and immigration detention centers. The things that are the least in our interest as US citizens are probably to give them citizenship or to deport them. And so we do everything else from a policy standpoint.
The wall that the Trump administration has been pushing for 3 years is a very interesting story, because when Donald Trump started talking about the wall, it was not actually a policy position that he had. His handlers told him to use the wall as a device to remember to talk about immigration. And then it caught on at his rallies, and it became a policy because he sold it so well that the people at the rallies started chanting the wall, and it became a policy. And now we're spending billions of dollars to build something that was actually just a device to get him to remember to talk about immigration. So now we're building a wall. Did you all know that?
Americans will pay for it.
That Mexico's paying.
There's shovels and ladders. Not quite so big.
And we have big sections of border wall and border fence. I think Barack Obama built more of it
He
than any other president.
built fencing, and I'm glad you brought that up, because the separation policy, there's been a lot of news about the separation policy, but didn't Barack Obama actually institute the separation policy while he was in office? Does anybody?
Yeah, I think so, but it wasn't enforced. So the separation policy wasn't a separation policy, right? The separation policy was a policy of, it's a criminal offense to enter the country illegally. And so if you enter the country illegally, then we can criminally prosecute you. And if the lawyers can help me with the lingo, right? But if we're holding you in some sort of jail, prison type place, we can't hold you with your kids. So there wasn't a policy of like, let's start separating these families, right? There was a policy of let's start prosecuting this.
Right. That's true.
And that was, right, not really a policy shift, but an enforcement shift in the Trump administration.
The issue is, I think, that the way that the Trump administration enforced it.
Right.
And they actually forced the separation. And then it got publicized the way it did, shown the way it was. And I think that public, the publicity around it was what the Trump administration actually wanted, because they thought it was going to deter people from coming.
Maybe that's what they wanted.
I think that's true.
Maybe they wanted to hold people at for-profit.
Yes.
Let me ask you this, and this is going to be our final question before we take some questions from the audience. Does President Trump have a point? Like his policy or not, whether you agree with his policy or not, does he have a point about curbing the flow of immigrants across our southern border?
Well, I believe every country should protect its borders. And no one should violate the law. That's key, regardless whether this is a Republican administration or Democratic administration. But I believe this administration's policy is based on prejudice and hatred of others, and exploiting this prejudice to mobilize a political base. So you can see from the political statements uttered by this president, even before he was president, as he was campaigning, he was insulting Mexicans, Muslims, and people of color, and he wanted to have immigrants only from white nations in Europe, and he used that famous word.
Yeah, he did.
So obviously it's not really about immigration itself, it's about race. Because America has confronted this issue of immigration for a long time in a humane fashion. But to cage children at the borders, to separate them from their parents, from their mothers, this is a very cruel policy. It's very inhumane, and it's not really based on breaking the law. You can always deal with law violators in a humane and compassionate way, especially when it comes to parents and children. And unfortunately, his base did not push back against him. They loved it. So I believe it's like an immoral approach to a real problem that we have.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I agree. I think countries have a right to have borders and enforce those borders. I think they also have a responsibility to look at what happens immediately outside of those borders. So I think the most recent example is the Remain in Mexico policy, right? So we now have a policy that asylum seekers have to stay on the Mexico side of the US-Mexico border. There are huge, huge tent cities. If you go just on the other side of Brownsville, right, there's 2,500 kids and families waiting to seek asylum here. And that is a sort of compromise agreement between the US government and the Mexican government, right? And so if we don't ever intend to give those people a shot at citizenship, a shot at refugee status, a shot at a real asylum application, which I don't think we do.
Right.
We shouldn't have them on the other side of our border, right? And if we do have them on our other side of our border, we have to ask ourselves why and what's driving that policy, right? We should either take a stance that there needs to be a big door, right? I remember Donald Trump talking about it's gonna be a big wall, but it's gonna have a big gold door in the middle of it, right? We don't actually have a door, that's a lie. We don't have a legal entryway.
And at the end of this presidency, when there's 2 million people seeking refugee status out there, who's gonna handle that?
Right. And what responsibility do we have for the number of kids, for instance, who are dying in those camps? Right, there's lots of families now being separated in a new way, which is that their parents walk with them to the bridge and have the kids run across and seek asylum inside, because kids have a special system by which they can seek asylum inside the border that their parents can't. Are we not still separating families?
Right. Involuntarily. All right, let's take some questions. Right? Was it that comprehensive? Oh, yes, ma'am.
So, like, I agree with all you guys, it was a really great talk, and so I just have a question about how it was brought up, how under the Trump administration, there are all these new norms that kind of we're experiencing, and this kind of like new explosive kind of like culture around us when it comes to race and then also policy, and how racism and politics can be exploited to create like tragic situations like kids being caged at the border and things like that. But do you think that really, even since the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, that America, we got really complacent in the sense that because you brought up that slogan, like everyone likes progress but no one likes change, we got complacent with the idea of, because we have these legal like pieces of legislation, then that means that the society is going to be fine, or the idea that discrimination doesn't exist, or the idea that there aren't systemic issues. So do you think America, we've gotten complacent over these past like 40, 50 years, I don't know, like past half a century? Do you think we've gotten complacent, and like Trump, instead of being the cause of problems, is really just a culmination of like a half a century of like unresolved issues and like kind of passivity? I think that's how you say it. Passiveness.
So I think I got the question. Did Trump, let me see if I can, are you saying did Trump just exploit the issues that were there?
Yeah, I'm kind of saying, do you think that because of the past, like do you think that America got complacent after the
Okay.
60s? And once we moved to the 70s and 80s, do you think America got complacent when it came to civil rights and civil liberties? And do you think Trump is a cause of a lot of the problems we see today, or a culmination of a lot of like pent-up?
That's better put.
Well, it's a really profound question.
Yeah.
There's a lot of wisdom
Yeah.
in the question itself.
Absolutely.
The answer is both. I think, and I imagine that's what you think. How much of it is Trump, and how much of it is Trump as a manifestation of the issues that were already there? But I thought another intriguing part of your question was when you said, did we get complacent? And I was just thinking, what's the we?
Right.
The we is.
Who's we?
And who is we? I mean,
Yeah.
clearly there were people who weren't complacent,
Mhm.
right? Not ones who agree with the we's primarily up here. So, you know, it's such a, it's a great question because there's so many components points to it, but to me, they're almost unanswerable. I do think that there were many people who were so thrilled when Barack Obama got elected, and we thought, not that it was post-racial, but that this was really a sea change and that now we won't go back. And now we see we're going back. And as liberals always do, we turn on ourselves and go, what did I do wrong? So I don't know, I would appreciate other people's comments.
Weren't there times that you saw Barack Obama kind of hamstrung by being the first black president when racial issues came up and he felt that he couldn't deal with the African-American part of it because he felt like he would go too far towards the dealing with the race side of it?
Because everyone sees you that way, and it's a very small, I don't mean to equate this in anything but a very small way, but you mentioned I was the first woman president of the Houston Bar. It didn't matter.
That was in your bio, I didn't say that, you gave it to me.
I gave it to you. I did say it. Now what I think I should have put down, think of all the things I could have put. You would have said them, but those were mostly true. But when I was president of there's a big difference. So when I was president of the Houston Bar as the first woman, everything I did, every article about me, every discussion about me was as a woman.
Right.
As a woman, as a woman. And it didn't matter what I did as bar president. I will never be remembered for anything I did as the bar president. It'll always be that I was the first woman. But when I was president of the state bar, I was the third woman. And I got to see the contrast between the two when it wasn't very interesting anymore to have a woman president. And it was so much easier. And like I say, that's my very small microcosm. It's nothing compared to Barack Obama. But to go back to your point, I think it's just incredible. The barriers that he had to, not just barriers, the problems he had to overcome just inherently because he was the first African American.
I remember
president.
every time something came up racial and he spoke on it, people,
Yeah.
I remember people saying, articles being written, he's just doing this because he's black.
And then the flip I heard too, which is he didn't do enough for black people.
Correct,
Mm-hmm.
correct.
You get both, and you go.
So how does he deal with that?
Okay, I have a different approach to this. I have two thoughts. First one, I believe, as an immigrant myself, what I have learned and witnessed, in American life, and studying the history of the U.S., that America has a deep wound and a challenge that has not overcome yet, which is the issue of race. And it's just a repeat, one generation after another. First, they started with the Native Americans. They were wiped out. And African Americans until today. Then Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, Catholics, all of them, all minorities, have suffered tremendous injustice in the United States. And there has not been a radical change to treat this once and for all. Why? Because the law is not enough. The Constitution, the best document mankind ever came up with, the U.S. Constitution, is sufficient. Is not sufficient. Is necessary but not sufficient. It does not solve the problem, because prejudice and hate is taught. If you look at two children, white and black, if they grow up together without the influence of the society, they will grow up loving each other naturally. They will not see that one is better than the other because of their skin color. So prejudice and hate is taught by the parents, by the society. And we do not have enough mechanisms within the society to eliminate it from the beginning. And I think faith traditions can play a role, and they have failed in eliminating this. The second part of my comment is the minorities who have suffered became complacent because now they are empowered. They're in a good place. And they forgot what Martin Luther King said, that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And an attack on one community is an attack on all of us. That has been blurred, unfortunately, and that's why every new community has to fight for itself instead of fighting along with other people. And that will continue, unfortunately, for next generation, because as a society, we have not radically agreed to nib it from the bud.
That's a great point. That stands for it. Yes, sir.
When do you think that we will stop?
Speak up.
Oh, sorry. When do you think that we'll stop viewing each other in these races, or is it somewhat of a problem with humanity that we group each other, like in group, out group? When are we going to? I'm going to quote Martin Luther King again. Look at each other as a person of character, not a person of color.
Well, I speak as a Muslim. I'm not gonna preach, okay? I speak as a Muslim. In my faith, as a Muslim, there's a verse in the Quran, so allow me to share it with you, because many people do not know about the Islamic faith. All people, all mankind, we have created you from a single male and female, and we made you into nations and tribes, so that you know one another. The most honorable of you in the sight of God is the most righteous one. So therefore, your last name, your skin color, your ethnic background, these are not qualifications. You should not judge other people based on them, and you should not be judged based on them. As Martin Luther King said, Jr., the contents of your character is what you will be judged on. So I think we need like radical thing to believe in and hold dear and judge people based on this, because right now the judgment is flawed.
I agree in spirit with everything that you said. I would disagree slightly with something that you said in the previous comment, which I think is related to the question. That you said that prejudice and hatred are taught. And that can certainly be true, right? I think people teach prejudice and hatred all the time. Unfortunately, we teach it to each other and we teach it to our kids. But as we know, based on my earlier comments, I also think that prejudice and hatred are bred. I think they're human nature. I think we're naturally born with some degree of prejudice and hatred towards people that possess power who are different from us, because it threatens our survival. And so to me, the question is really not when are we going to stop teaching prejudice and hatred, but when are we going to teach the opposite, right? It's not a coincidence to me that every faith in the entire world has some sort of verses about judging people on the content of their character, rather than on the color of their skin, right? We just can't, we need to learn that lesson. All over the world, all across the ages, we just have failed to learn that lesson. Even when it hasn't been about issues of race, going back to your question, right? Have we been complacent over the last 3 decades or 4 decades? I think the folks arguing for LGBT rights would say no, right? They haven't been complacent. It's the same issue. It's any time that somebody different from us has power, we're threatened and we're frightened. And we have to try to squash that, right? So the question to me is, when are we going to teach the opposite? When can we actually societally teach acceptance, radical acceptance from an early age? I think we would have to believe it, right?
Hang on. I'll go here and I'll go
Okay,
there.
so I had a friend in junior college with me, and she was white. She went for a young women's scholarship, help pay for college. And she went into her interview and she came out and she told me a couple days later, she was denied because they were looking for more people who were minorities. Situations like these, do you think they're helping, or do you think they're making that divide bigger between race relations? Whoever.
I think that's a super hard question.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that sucks for your friend. It sucks for many generations of people who haven't been able to go to the Naval Academy because they weren't the right color.
But is it the pendulum swinging the other way? Is it?
I don't think so. I don't think it's swinging too far. I think it's swinging further towards the middle, and that's very painful for a lot of people. I think we all probably have to give a little, but that doesn't change the fact that, yeah, it really sucks for her to be told that. And that probably shouldn't happen, right? That's also probably like just in an administrative level, she probably shouldn't have competed for something that she wasn't eligible for. They shouldn't have put her in that position. Not your friend, I mean the people in charge of it, you know?
How about the balanced approach? Right now, we want to accommodate minority, but not by depriving other people. The system can be where you grant minorities who have been deprived those opportunities, give them, more space, not at the expense of other people. As if we say that we have so much limited space that to apply justice, we have to make some people angry who have been, afforded these privileges for a long time. We still can create a balance by, giving more access to minority, which we have not done for a long time, and at the same time allow the same access to white people, for example. But one should not be at the expense of others, because we've done it for centuries. And now when we started to repair the damage, we are being perceived as we're causing another damage somewhere else. So the system is flawed itself.
But to his question, sometimes it is a zero-sum game. Sometimes there is one scholarship or one position.
Yeah, but she should not be told, oh, you have to be black to be admitted. I mean, being white is not like a sin. Like being, white or black is not, you should not be judged based on your color. But if your color has been seen as a deficit, as a minus, we have to fix that. But I should not, prevent or deprive other people from a right that they have. So because maybe it's not her sin or her fault that African Americans or people of color have been deprived, and that's why she feels the injustice. Like, why me? I was not the cause for what happened to her.
And I'm wondering if because of younger people, a lot of them having that attitude and things like that happening, if that's making the divide and the problem worse.
I think the problem is that it's still so unfair. You know what I mean? So it's still people from ethnic minority groups, people from immigrant groups, people from LGBT groups are still so underrepresented in everything, right? In scholarship money, in employment, in higher ed, they're still so underrepresented in all of those groups that while on the one hand I'm like, yeah, that is really unfortunate for your friend and that shouldn't happen, and if I were her parent or her friend, I would be indignant, right, on her behalf. At the same time, societally, I can't pretend that the pendulum has swung in that direction, because it just hasn't, right? The numbers don't show that.
To what extent, a situation like that, are we not, so I'm the dean of the college, I'm acting as the dean of the college. So when I hear situations like that, one of the first things that pops to mind is that part of the problem is we are setting up economic circumstances that set groups against each other, okay? So your friend should not need a scholarship to attend community college, okay? And the real issue in my mind is that we've underfunded public education and made it unaffordable for lots and lots of people, okay? And instead of so, the GI Bill after World War II, lots and lots of people were able to go to college who never could before, right? Pell Grants and that kind of thing that came out of Lyndon Johnson's administration as well, and then in the late 60s opened all kinds of access. But if you look at public funding of higher ed over the last 20 to 30 years and the funding of grants that are available to students, right? All that has been retracted, right? And so you've got higher prices for the average family, right? And the average person, right? And when I was in college, I'm a first generation college student, my scholarships and I got Pell Grants, I actually had money left over to help pay my rent, believe it or not, after I paid my and it was a public institution. No student today has that kind of money, right? It's just impossible.
And the hijacking.
And the hijacking of that is, so as a result, you guys are getting squeezed with these student loans, which are just an abomination in my opinion, okay? And so we're setting people against each other, right? I think the core issue is your friend being deprived, right? It's to the point of why isn't there enough for everybody? We're the richest society in the world. Why isn't there enough for everybody?
When they hijacked the student loans and gave them to private banks, that really hurt the system.
I mean, and at Sam Houston, our student indebtedness is actually pretty low, comparatively speaking, but holy crap, you guys are owing like 20 grand by the time you leave college, right? And so, that's a car loan on top of your car loan, right?
Yeah.
And when I was a college student in the eighties, we weren't leaving with that kind of debt if you went to an institution. And again, our indebtedness is pretty low comparatively speaking to a lot of things and that kind of thing. So I think with issues like that, and I think you can get to issues of healthcare access and all that kind of stuff, right? These things are becoming increasingly very expensive commodities. What I would consider a basic human right is becoming a very expensive commodity, right? That only a few can afford, or fewer can afford, and it's pitting us against each other. And I think race and gender are just two of the ways that we're being pitted against each other. My 2 cents.
We're about out of time.
Yeah, in fact, I don't have a question. It's just a comment that I and Dr. Sandra brought each one's attention to concerning the verse that Dr. Omni had mentioned. I mean, just to add to it, when he said that the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the righteous, I want just to comment on that. The righteous here simply means the pious, or in a more general sense, someone who is like characterized by or proceeding from accepted standards of justice and morality and faith. Yeah. Just that.
I just had a quick question for you. As someone who has read about you guys' history, and I come from a dilapidated housing area, so to see someone like you till this day, I heard you make the comment and you said a lot of people today in this younger generation are a little bit scared. That's exactly what it is. I'm telling you because we have conversations about this frequently. Pretty much it is scary to get in the car and know that you're pretty much a target as soon as you're getting pulled over. It's get out the car. I'm just giving you an example, but the thing is, guys, getting jobs and everything like that, it is very hard. I mean, I went to school. I'm the first person to go to school, to go to college. Didn't finish. Still have a lot of student loans. But hey, I went. And I found out who I am today. So for someone like you I drove down here 2 hours to come see you. So I want to know exactly what is it that you can say to me so I can take home to the masses to tell them that it's motivation to keep going. Because you had a lot of situations that paved the way for a lot of us today. So I just want to know, what is it that you want to give to the young urban crowd?
The first thing I would tell you is don't give up. You know, you started your journey, and it's still out there. And I would say continue the journey that you started. There's a lot of obstacles out there, which we all know. But you sound as though you can get by those. You sound as though you can beat the odds. And hey, you're not alone. There's thousands of others out there just like you. But you got to be the one that just keep making those giant steps. It might not be much, but like I stated, you've already started your journey. And there's so many behind you who still just sitting there waiting.
Great question. We got 1 minute left. We're going to take this question right here. I don't know if we're going to have time. I'm sorry. You go ahead. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Okay. This is, I had 2 questions.
Well, you get one.
Everybody gets one.
Okay. So Amanda had earlier talked about like different tribes, and to an extent I think that's true, like different minorities. Like there's Black culture, there's Latino culture, there's obviously like a really big Muslim culture. But he was talking about the younger generation, and I feel like as the younger generation, like we've definitely had like more of like a mixing of tribes, and like minorities are like more understanding towards each other. You know, like there's a very strong like Afro-Latino community that's on the rise. Like you were talking about earlier, there's a strong like Black Muslim community. So like, how do you think that's like influencing race relations? And that's for like everybody.
Well, I would say that's exactly how you change it, right? So by blending tribes. I think when it gets confusing who's in your in-group and who's in your out-group is when you have some fighting chance at solving the problem, right? And so I think like conversations about intersectionality and all of that kind of stuff has also helped, right? I'm a woman, I'm a person of color, I'm a millennial, right? So I'm a lot of different things, and I think I think our only chance really is to blend the in-group and the out-group in the way that I think progress and time will help with, exactly like you're saying.
All right. I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm Chris Critico. Thank you for the panel.